The flight was calm as the plane cruised high above the clouds, wrapped in a blanket of steady engine hum and soft cabin lighting. Passengers were settled into their seats, some watching movies, others sleeping, and a few staring out of the small oval windows at the endless white clouds below. It was supposed to be an ordinary journey, the kind people would forget the moment they landed. No one on board had any idea that within minutes, this peaceful routine would be shattered by an event that would change every life on that plane forever. Inside the cockpit, the pilot sat upright, hands steady on the controls, eyes scanning the instruments out of habit more than necessity. Years of experience had made this phase of flight almost automatic. The co-pilot was reviewing routine data, occasionally glancing outside. Everything was normal. The aircraft was stable, cruising smoothly at high altitude, guided by autopilot systems that rarely failed. Then, without warning, the pilot's hand slipped from the control panel. His body stiffened for a brief second before slumping forward. The co-pilot turned, confused at first, then alarmed as he realized something was terribly wrong. The pilot had collapsed. For a moment, there was stunned silence in the cockpit, broken only by the steady beep of instruments and the distant roar of engines. The co-pilot rushed to his side, calling his name, shaking his shoulder, trying to get a response. There was none. The pilot's face had gone pale, his breathing shallow and irregular. Training kicked in instantly. The co-pilot tried to take full control, but almost immediately he realized the situation was worse than expected. The pilot's sudden fall had caused a chain reaction, knocking critical systems offline and triggering warnings across the dashboard. In the cabin, passengers sensed something was wrong even before any announcement was made. The plane dipped slightly, not enough to cause panic at first, but enough for heads to lift and nervous glances to be exchanged. A flight attendant paused mid-step, gripping the seat in front of her as the aircraft corrected itself. Another warning chime echoed softly through the cabin, unfamiliar and unsettling. Whispered questions spread from row to row. Was it turbulence? A mechanical issue? No one had answers. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. The co-pilot struggled to stabilize the aircraft while simultaneously attempting to revive the pilot. His radio calls to air traffic control were frantic but controlled, following procedure as best as possible. He reported the medical emergency, requested immediate assistance, and tried to explain the partial loss of control. The response came quickly, but help was far away. The plane was still thousands of feet in the air, hundreds of miles from the nearest suitable airport. Panic began to grow in the cabin like a slow-burning fire. Passengers noticed the flight attendants whispering urgently to one another. Their forced smiles had disappeared, replaced by tight expressions and quick movements. One attendant finally made an announcement, her voice calm but strained, informing everyone that there was a situation in the cockpit and asking passengers to remain seated and calm. That single sentence was enough to send fear rippling through the rows. A man clutched the armrest beside him, his knuckles white. A woman began to cry quietly, holding her child close. Phones were pulled out, messages typed with shaking hands, final words sent just in case. The aircraft shuddered again, slightly stronger this time, and a collective gasp filled the cabin. The reality was sinking in. This was not a minor issue. Something had gone seriously wrong. Among the passengers was a 13-year-old girl sitting a few rows behind the wing. She had been reading a book, headphones resting loosely around her neck. When the plane dipped, she looked up, her eyes sharp and alert. Unlike many others, she didn't scream or panic. She listened. She watched. She noticed details others missed, like the pattern of the warning sounds and the tense body language of the crew. Her name was barely known to anyone on board, but her past experiences had quietly prepared her for this moment. Her father sat beside her, trying to stay calm for her sake, though fear was written all over his face. He squeezed her hand, offering reassurance he wasn't sure he believed himself. She squeezed back, not in fear, but in focus. Her mind was racing, piecing together what little information she had. She had spent countless hours on flight simulators back home, not as a game, but as a serious hobby. Aviation fascinated her. She knew the basics, the terminology, the logic behind the controls. She had never imagined she would need that knowledge in real life. Another announcement crackled through the speakers, more urgent this time. The co-pilot asked if there was anyone on board with flight experience who could assist. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Passengers looked around at one another, eyes wide, silently pleading for someone else to stand up. No one moved. Fear glued them to their seats. The girl felt her heart pound, but not from terror. From decision. She looked at her father, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. She told him quietly that she knew how planes worked. At first, he thought she was joking, or trying to distract herself. Then he saw her expression. Calm, serious, determined. Before he could stop her, she pressed the call button and spoke to the flight attendant who rushed over. What happened next felt unreal. The attendant hesitated, clearly torn between disbelief and desperation. A 13-year-old girl. But time was running out, and no one else had stepped forward. The attendant relayed the information to the cockpit. There was a pause. Then the response came back. Send her in. As she walked toward the cockpit, the aisle felt impossibly long. Passengers watched her pass, confusion and hope mixing in their eyes. Some whispered prayers. Others stared in disbelief. The cockpit door opened, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. Alarms flashed. The co-pilot looked exhausted, sweat on his forehead, eyes bloodshot from stress. He looked at her, doubt flickering across his face, but there was no time to argue. She explained quickly, clearly, using the language of aviation, proving in seconds that she wasn't guessing or pretending. His doubt turned into cautious trust. He guided her to the seat, adjusting it for her smaller frame, explaining what had failed and what still worked. The plane was drifting off its intended course, altitude fluctuating dangerously. Her hands hovered over the controls for a brief moment. This was no simulator. This was real metal, real lives, real consequences. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the yoke. Step by step, she followed instructions, her voice calm as she confirmed each action. Air traffic control was patched through, their voices steady and precise, guiding her from hundreds of miles away. She listened carefully, blocking out everything else. Fear had no place here. Only focus. Slowly, the aircraft stabilized. The wild warnings eased. The altitude leveled out. In the cabin, passengers felt the difference immediately. The shaking lessened. The plane flew straight and true again. A fragile sense of hope spread like sunlight breaking through clouds. Minutes turned into an hour as she continued to guide the aircraft toward the nearest airport. Her arms ached. Her mind was exhausted. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every person on board depended on her. The co-pilot managed other systems and monitored the unconscious pilot, who was now receiving basic medical aid from a crew member. As the runway finally came into view, the tension reached its peak. Landing was the hardest part. She had practiced it dozens of times virtually, but never like this. The ground rushed toward them, the plane descending faster than felt comfortable. Her breathing was controlled, her eyes locked ahead. With guidance from the tower and the co-pilot's calm voice beside her, she adjusted speed, angle, and alignment. The wheels hit the runway hard but straight. The aircraft bounced once, then settled, rolling forward as brakes engaged. When the plane finally slowed to a stop, silence filled the cabin for half a second. Then the plane erupted. Crying, laughter, applause. Strangers hugged each other. Some dropped to their knees in relief. The girl sat frozen for a moment, hands still on the controls, her body trembling now that the danger had passed. The co-pilot looked at her, eyes shining with disbelief and gratitude. She had done it. Emergency crews rushed the plane, tending to the pilot and ensuring everyone's safety. News of what had happened spread quickly, but in that moment, inside that aircraft, there was only one truth everyone shared. An ordinary flight had turned into an extraordinary miracle, not because of advanced technology or luck, but because a 13-year-old girl had been brave enough to step forward when no one else could. And for the rest of their lives, every passenger on that plane would remember the day a child became their pilot, and fear gave way to courage at 30,000 feet above the ground. The girl sat quietly in her seat by the window, her feet not quite reaching the floor, her forehead lightly resting against the cool glass as the vast blue sky stretched endlessly outside. To anyone watching, she looked like just another child on a routine flight, headphones in, eyes calm, hands folded neatly in her lap. No one could have guessed that behind her soft, thoughtful expression was a mind filled with diagrams of cockpits, mental checklists, and hundreds of hours of absorbed knowledge gathered not from classrooms or simulators but from curiosity alone. While other kids her age spent evenings playing games or scrolling endlessly, she had chosen a different world. She had fallen in love with airplanes the first time she saw one roar across the sky above her neighborhood, its shadow gliding silently over rooftops like a promise of adventure. Her parents often smiled at her unusual hobby. They would find her late at night watching flight deck recordings, pausing videos to replay a pilot's hand movements, rewinding explanations about flaps, altitudes, and radio calls. She didn't just watch for entertainment, she studied. She learned the names of instruments, the meaning of warning lights, and the calm, precise language pilots used even in stressful situations. She memorized how planes behaved during takeoff and landing, how autopilot systems worked, and why pilots trusted procedures more than panic. For her, aviation wasn't about thrill or danger, it was about control, discipline, and trust in systems built to keep people safe. As the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, the hum of the engines felt familiar and comforting to her. She could almost identify their pitch, guessing the altitude from sound alone. Her younger sibling slept beside her, while her parents quietly read, unaware that in just moments, everything would change. When the sudden movement at the front of the aircraft occurred, she didn't see it at first, but she felt it. A slight shift in the plane's motion, barely noticeable to most, sent a quiet signal through her mind. She looked up instinctively, her heart tightening just a little, as if something unseen had disrupted the rhythm she understood so well. The whispers began quickly. Flight attendants moved faster than before, their faces still polite but tense. The girl removed her headphones, listening closely. Years of watching real cockpit audio had trained her ears to pick up subtle changes in tone. She heard urgency in hushed voices, the kind that tried to stay calm but carried weight beneath it. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with awareness. Something serious was happening. When the announcement finally came, carefully worded but unmistakable, her stomach sank. The pilot had collapsed. The co-pilot was struggling. They needed help. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a sudden wave. Some passengers clutched armrests, others whispered prayers, and a few began to cry openly. Panic tried to take hold, but the girl remained still, her mind racing faster than her body. She replayed countless scenarios she had seen online, emergency landings explained step by step, instructors calmly guiding untrained people through impossible situations. She remembered how every expert always said the same thing: airplanes are designed to be forgiving, and knowledge, even basic knowledge, matters. When a flight attendant asked over the intercom if anyone had flight experience, the silence felt heavy. No hands went up. The girl felt her chest tighten. She wasn't a pilot. She had never touched a real control yoke. But she knew the language, the logic, the flow of actions. She knew that doing nothing was worse than trying. Her legs trembled as she stood, her voice barely audible at first as she spoke to her parents. They stared at her in shock, fear flashing across their faces, but beneath it was something else: trust. They had seen her dedication. They knew how serious she was about aviation. As she walked down the aisle, every step felt unreal, like she had stepped into one of the videos she had watched so many times. The cockpit door opened, revealing a scene she recognized instantly, not from memory, but from repetition. The panels, the seats, the instruments all looked eerily familiar, yet overwhelmingly real. The co-pilot, pale and shaken, looked at her with disbelief, but desperation left no room for doubt. She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to stay steady, and began to speak, explaining what she knew, what she could do. Her eyes scanned the instruments, not randomly, but methodically. Airspeed, altitude, attitude indicator. They matched what she expected at cruising level. The autopilot was engaged. That was good. Very good. She remembered experts always saying that as long as autopilot was on, the plane would keep flying itself. Her hands hovered, careful not to touch anything without reason. She repeated procedures softly to herself, grounding her thoughts. aviate, navigate, communicate. On the radio, air traffic control responded quickly, their voices calm and firm. They asked who was flying the plane. Her heart pounded as she answered honestly, her young voice echoing through the headset. There was a pause, then reassurance. They didn't panic. That steadied her. She listened carefully as instructions came through, recognizing the structure immediately. They spoke in steps, not commands, guiding her exactly as she had seen in training videos. Her confidence grew, not because she felt powerful, but because everything made sense. As the plane began its descent, turbulence shook the cabin lightly. Somewhere behind her, passengers held hands, cried, and hoped. She focused only on the instruments, blocking out everything else. She adjusted settings as instructed, confirming each action aloud. The runway came into view through the cockpit window, long and narrow, exactly as she had imagined so many times before. Fear tried once more to creep in, whispering that she was only a child, that this was impossible. She pushed it aside, replacing it with procedure. The final moments were the hardest. Her arms ached, her palms slick with sweat, but her eyes never left the horizon line. She remembered how instructors always said to trust the approach, to let the plane settle, not to force it. When the wheels finally touched the runway, the impact was firm but controlled. The roar of engines reversed, slowing them down, and then, at last, they stopped. Silence filled the cockpit for a single heartbeat before it shattered into sound. Cheers, sobs, laughter, relief. The girl sat back, her body suddenly heavy, the adrenaline draining away. She hadn't thought about being brave. She hadn't thought about being special. She had only done what she loved, what she understood. As emergency crews rushed in and passengers poured out safely, the world outside the cockpit saw her not as a quiet child anymore, but as proof that curiosity, dedication, and calm thinking could rise to meet even the most impossible moment. With guidance coming through the radio from air traffic control, the brave girl stepped into the cockpit. The door felt heavier than it looked, as if the weight of the entire aircraft rested on its hinges. When it finally opened, a rush of unfamiliar sounds poured out. Warning chimes, low electronic hums, and the steady roar of engines slicing through the thin air. The pilot lay slumped in his seat, unmoving, his headset slightly askew. For a brief moment, fear froze her in place. This was no longer a story she had watched on a screen or imagined late at night. This was real, and hundreds of lives depended on what happened next. Her hands trembled as she moved forward, every step feeling uncertain, as though the floor itself might disappear beneath her feet. The co-pilot's seat was empty, and the glowing panels in front of it looked impossibly complex. Rows of buttons, switches, and screens blinked in colors she recognized only vaguely from videos she had watched. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Somewhere behind her, passengers cried, prayed, or sat in stunned silence. She took a deep breath, just like she had seen pilots do before speaking, and forced herself to focus. A crackle came through the radio, followed by a calm, steady voice. The air traffic controller spoke slowly, carefully, as if every word were being placed gently into her hands. He told her she was not alone. He told her to listen closely. He told her they would do this together. The reassurance in his tone wrapped around her like a safety net, and for the first time since she had entered the cockpit, her fear loosened its grip just a little. She slipped into the pilot's seat, the leather cool beneath her fingers. The controls felt larger than she expected, heavier, more solid. Her feet barely reached the pedals, and she had to adjust the seat forward, just as she had seen in countless tutorials. The controller guided her step by step, asking simple questions first. Was the plane stable? Were the wings level? She glanced at the artificial horizon on the screen, recognizing it instantly. Yes, she said, her voice shaking but clear. The plane was flying straight. As minutes passed, the instructions became more detailed. He explained which screen showed altitude, which showed airspeed, and which showed direction. Each familiar term felt like a small victory. She remembered pausing videos to take notes, replaying explanations until they made sense. Now those hours no longer felt like idle curiosity. They felt like preparation. She repeated each instruction out loud before acting, grounding herself in the rhythm of the process. The turbulence began lightly at first, a gentle rocking that made her stomach tighten. The controller warned her in advance, telling her not to panic, telling her the plane could handle it. She adjusted the controls carefully, resisting the urge to overcorrect. Her arms ached from the tension of holding steady, but she refused to let go. Every movement was deliberate, cautious, respectful of the machine she now guided through the sky. Her mind drifted briefly to her family sitting somewhere behind her. She imagined her parents holding hands, trying to stay strong for her siblings. She knew they were scared, and the thought hurt more than the fear she felt for herself. That pain became fuel. She straightened her back, wiped her palms against her jeans, and focused again on the instruments. She would not let them down. The radio crackled again, and a new voice joined the conversation, another controller offering support. They discussed weather conditions, runway options, and distance, all while including her in every decision. They never talked over her or about her as if she weren't there. They treated her like a pilot, and that trust gave her strength. She asked questions when she didn't understand, and they answered patiently, without judgment. As the plane began its gradual descent, the numbers on the screens changed slowly, steadily. She adjusted the throttle as instructed, feeling the subtle shift in engine sound. The controller explained how to manage the descent angle, reminding her to keep the speed within a safe range. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her movements grew more confident with each successful adjustment. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. The city lights appeared far below, scattered like stars across the dark earth. She had seen this view before from passenger windows, but now it looked different. Now it was a destination, a goal she was guiding them toward. The runway lights shimmered in the distance, thin and bright, almost unreal. The controller pointed them out, telling her to line up the nose of the plane with those lights, to keep them steady in her view. Her breathing slowed as she matched the plane's movement to the instructions. The controls no longer felt foreign. They felt responsive, almost cooperative, as if the aircraft itself wanted to help her succeed. The radio remained a constant presence, calm voices reminding her of what came next, breaking the impossible task into manageable steps. When the landing gear was deployed, the sound startled her, a loud mechanical thump echoing through the cockpit. Her heart jumped, but the controller had warned her, and she nodded to herself, gripping the yoke firmly. The plane felt heavier now, less eager to glide, and she adjusted accordingly. Every second seemed stretched, time bending under the weight of anticipation. Wind pushed against the aircraft, testing her resolve. She corrected gently, just as she had practiced in simulations, just as she had seen professionals do. The runway grew larger, the lights brighter, rushing toward her faster than she expected. Her pulse raced, but her focus sharpened. This was the moment everything led to. The controller's voice softened, slowing even more. He reminded her to trust herself, to trust what she had learned. She eased back slightly, reducing speed, keeping the nose steady. The ground rose to meet them, and for a heartbeat, everything felt suspended between sky and earth. Then the wheels touched down. Not perfectly, not smoothly like in the videos, but safely. The jolt ran through the plane, through her body, through her very bones. She held the controls as instructed, keeping the plane straight as it rolled along the runway. Cheers erupted from the cabin behind her, muffled but unmistakable. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away, staying focused until the plane slowed and finally came to a stop. Only then did she let go. Her hands shook violently now, the adrenaline releasing all at once. She leaned back in the seat, exhausted, overwhelmed, and alive. The radio crackled one last time, the controller's voice thick with emotion as he told her she had done an incredible job. She closed her eyes and smiled through tears, knowing that in this moment, she wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the reason everyone was safe. The wheels touched the runway with a force that jolted every soul on board, but it was the most beautiful jolt any of them had ever felt. For a brief, suspended moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The sound of rubber screaming against asphalt echoed through the cabin, followed by the deep, steady roar of reverse thrust as the aircraft began to slow. Then it happened. The plane stayed straight. It stayed grounded. It stayed alive. A second passed. Then another. And suddenly, reality crashed into the cabin harder than the landing itself. Someone screamed. Not in fear this time, but in disbelief. Another passenger burst into tears, hands covering their face. Applause exploded from every direction, wild and uncontrolled, mixed with sobs, laughter, and prayers spoken in trembling voices. Strangers grabbed each other, hugging without permission, without hesitation. Parents clutched their children as if letting go would undo the miracle that had just occurred. The fear that had sat heavy in their chests for what felt like hours finally shattered, replaced by overwhelming relief. In the cockpit, the 13-year-old girl sat frozen in the pilot's seat, her small hands still gripping the controls as if the plane might slip away if she loosened her hold. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could be heard over the engines. Her legs felt weak, almost numb, and her breathing came in short, uneven bursts. She had done it. Somehow, impossibly, she had done it. But her mind struggled to accept what her eyes were seeing. The runway stretched out in front of her, solid and real. The speed indicators dropped. The aircraft slowed to a manageable roll. A calm voice came through the radio, though now it carried emotion it had carefully hidden before. The controller spoke her name softly, congratulating her, telling her she was safe, telling her to ease the plane to a stop. She followed the instructions one last time, gently guiding the aircraft off the main runway and onto a taxiway. When the plane finally came to a complete halt, silence fell again, deeper than before. Then the cockpit door opened. A flight attendant stepped inside, her eyes wide and filled with tears. For a moment, she could not speak. She simply looked at the girl sitting in the captain's seat, this child who had just accomplished what many trained adults would struggle to do under perfect conditions. Finally, she knelt down and wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. The girl broke then, the shock finally releasing its grip. She cried into the uniform, not from fear anymore, but from exhaustion, relief, and the sudden weight of what had just happened. Word spread through the cabin quickly. Passengers craned their necks toward the cockpit, whispering in disbelief. A young girl. A child. 13 years old. The realization sent fresh waves of emotion through the plane. People who moments earlier had been preparing themselves for the worst now found themselves witnesses to a story that felt impossible, unreal, like something from a movie rather than their own lives. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft as it sat safely on the ground. Lights flashed red and blue against the metal body of the plane, a stark contrast to the quiet miracle that had unfolded inside. Medics rushed on board to attend to the collapsed pilot, who was still unconscious but alive, his breathing steady now. Others checked on passengers, though most insisted they were fine, still too overwhelmed to think about anything except the girl who had saved them. When she finally stepped out of the cockpit and into the aisle, the cabin erupted again. Applause thundered through the space, louder than before. People stood despite instructions to remain seated. Some reached out to touch her arm, her shoulder, as if to reassure themselves that she was real. Others simply placed a hand over their heart and nodded at her, unable to find words that felt big enough. She walked slowly, guided by a flight attendant, her face flushed, eyes red from crying. She looked smaller now, stripped of the impossible responsibility she had carried moments earlier. She searched the crowd until she found her family. Her mother was sobbing openly, her father holding onto the seat in front of him as if his legs would give out at any second. When they finally reached each other, they collapsed into a tight embrace, the kind that speaks of fear imagined and lives nearly lost. Later, as the passengers disembarked, the story continued to unfold. Authorities asked questions gently, carefully, as if afraid that pushing too hard might shatter the fragile wonder of the moment. The girl answered as best she could, her voice soft, almost shy. She spoke about listening, about remembering what she had watched and learned, about trusting the voices on the radio. She did not call herself brave. She said she was just trying to help. She said she didn't want anyone to die. News of the landing spread fast, faster than anyone could control. By the time the passengers reached the terminal, phones were buzzing with messages, alerts, and headlines. A 13-year-old lands passenger plane after pilot collapses. A child saves dozens of lives. A miracle at 30,000 feet. Cameras appeared, reporters calling out questions, flashing lights turning the quiet airport hallway into chaos. Airport officials quickly guided the girl and her family away, shielding them from the sudden storm of attention. That night, long after the airport had returned to its usual rhythm, the passengers lay awake in hotel rooms or finally made it home, replaying the moments again and again. The scream of the engines. The calm voice on the radio. The feeling of descent. The instant the wheels hit the ground. Many knew they would never forget it. Some felt changed forever, their understanding of courage rewritten by the actions of a child. The girl herself lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the controls beneath her hands, heard the controller's voice guiding her through the darkness. She thought about how close everything had come to ending, and how strange it felt that her curiosity, something so simple, had made all the difference. She did not feel like a hero. She felt tired. She felt lucky. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a quiet certainty that the sky would always be part of her life. Days later, letters and messages poured in from strangers around the world. Pilots praised her composure. Teachers called her an inspiration. Parents hugged their children a little tighter. Yet for those who had been on that plane, the story was not about fame or headlines. It was about a moment when hope appeared in the most unexpected form. About how courage does not always look like strength or confidence, but sometimes like trembling hands that refuse to let go. Against all odds, a plane that should not have landed did. Against all expectations, a child did what trained professionals spend years preparing for. And against the fear that had filled that cabin, humanity witnessed something rare and powerful. A reminder that bravery has no age, that knowledge can come from curiosity, and that in the darkest moments, the smallest voice can guide everyone safely home.